Hi, my name is Castelia Wyatt, and this is my Cultural Factors and Health Disparities presentation on auditory impairment population. For the purpose of this presentation, I have used the word deaf to describe anyone that is hard of hearing, partially deaf, or fully deaf, just to make it a little easier. In this community, media portrayal is lacking quite a bit. There is a lack of representation of different careers, books, and other materials that teach the younger children within this community and anyone else in the community that they're being represented as well and that there is nothing wrong with them. There's also a stigma that these individuals have a disability and that they don't have as much as anyone else, but they don't see it that way. They have their own culture, they're very immersed in it, and they're very proud to be a part of it. To them, it's very offensive to insinuate that their hearing needs to be fixed because that would change who they are, and they are proud to be part of this community and love the world that they live in because of their deafness. They do feel like they are a minority, as it is seen, because they have their own culture, their own language, in a world far beyond that what we, as they call the hearing world, sees. There's a couple terms that are sometimes portrayed, autism and oralism, and they're very degrading to this population. Autism is the idea that those who can hear are superior, and oralism is teaching deaf individuals to speak. These inaccuracies that I've just gone over do cause this population to be misunderstood, often in things like they're uneducated, unable to perform the same jobs as others, and being more isolated from others. In this community, family and peer support is very important. Depending on the family dynamics and the parents' views of life being deaf or hard of hearing, they could either encourage their child to use ASL and introduce them to others in the deaf community, or they could mainstream them, which means put them into a hearing school and make them learn spoken languages and not introduce them to the hearing community. But it is proven that exposure to visual language for these children and having deaf role models is very important. Golos and Moses, this article that I have, talk about deaf gain. This means that the family can look at the deaf community as a benefit and a resource to help them and help promote education for their family. Vulnerability and barriers in the deaf community. These individuals can be very vulnerable dependent on what has been taught to them. Some culture passed down through generational deaf families is us hearing versus them deaf mentality. So they tend to stick with each other, they avoid the hearing world, feel like hearing people are against them, which can make them vulnerable to multiple health disparities and not understanding the things that are going on around them or being able to communicate in the hearing world. The other side is the family that they're born into. So if they're a first generational deaf individual or a second generation or multi-generational deaf individual. If they're a first generation, this puts them at a higher risk for mental illness and the loss of belonging, whereas if they have a family role model of living in this culture and world or immersed in the deaf culture, they have more of a sense of belonging and understanding who they are and feeling like they are meant to be somewhere, but may be at a higher risk for health disparities as related to multi-generational culture mentioned before. The biggest barriers are the stigmas that segregate this community from everyone else. Like I mentioned before, this would be stigmas of being disabled, needing to be fixed, or being uneducated. This leads to exclusion and a lack of desire or frustration when trying to go out and communicate outside of their deaf community. I couldn't find anything really on this community being shunned or in danger anywhere in the world, just more of an issue of being misunderstood by others. The biggest thing with the legal and political system with deaf population is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this helps individuals in this population get proper assistance when they're seeking help so that they can be just as informed and involved in their care as others and aren't alone or not explained to. The only downside to this is it just requires them to have translation services. It doesn't negate what type of translation service that is, And many in this population get very frustrated because they do prefer an in-person translation versus like an iPad translation or anything else, just because of technical difficulties. And just like with English, like spoken English, there is different dialects, you could say, with ASL dependent on where you live in the country. And factors influencing health outcomes in the deaf community, there are things like their socioeconomic status. So deaf individuals can be at higher risk for health disparities based on this. In a study by McKee et al., only 11.5% of deaf individuals only had an education in high school or less, but 46.4% had some college, with 42.4% of them having a 4-year degree or higher. Despite these numbers, 46.8% made less than $25,000 a year. Race and gender, I didn't find much to say race or gender specifically affected this population negatively, but a higher number tend to have an inadequate health literacy based on other factors. So race and gender didn't really affect their health literacy, just the fact that they were deaf. Religion as well, I didn't see any other factors of religion negatively affecting this population, and saw many religions actually offered services for the deaf, like having a special deaf congregation where they could meet with other people in their community, or interpreting services that were offered. Geographical location. Depending on where these individuals live, there could be a major lack of ability to access resources to help them. A big issue I found was access to mental health professionals who knew sign language and were tailored to this population. Telehealth would be an excellent resource if there was a way to get more ASL speaking providers to be able to be available for the service. The only issue would come into play if they needed to do some kind of physical examination. Biases within the deaf community, whether implicit or explicit. Implicit biases within the deaf community are things like the autism, like they feel like hearing people feel superior to them and expect that they should either be able to speak orally or can lip read. This is a big issue because it's expected that they acclimate to the hearing world and find a way to survive communicating with hearing people versus hearing people adapting to the deaf population. This causes these individuals to be less willing to reach out for help from hearing providers and caregivers. Explicit biases. These are the idea that they have a disability, and to be told over and over again causes them to disengage with hearing individuals who believe that. They don't feel they're disabled, and most embrace their difference. They don't want to be told that they need to be fixed, and it places a distrust with medical personnel when it is suggested the deafness should be fixed in one way or another. Regions with less disparity. For this population, it would be fair to say there's less disparity in those places with a higher deaf population because there would be more services offered in those areas for these individuals. Places in the United States that I found had a higher deaf population to hearing, specifically Rochester, New York, and the 3 highest states were Oregon, Idaho, and West Virginia. And these are my references that I used to create my presentation.